The dust rose in lazy spirals from the cracked earth, choking the air like a living thing. Clara's boots scraped against the parched ground as she trudged toward the auction block in the center of town, the sun hammering down on her shoulders with unrelenting fury. Her dress, once a faded blue, hung limp and sweat-soaked, clinging to her skin like a second layer of grief. The wind tugged at her bonnet, whispering secrets she didn't want to hear, memories of Henry's cough echoing through their empty cabin, the way his hand had gone cold in hers one dawn not 2 weeks past. Now the land was swallowing everything, indifferent as the buzzards wheeling high above, their shadows crossing her path like omens. The town square was a meager affair. A few weathered storefronts leaning against each other for support. A saloon spilling out the sour stink of whiskey and unwashed men, and the auctioneer's platform rigged from old wagon planks. Folks gathered in loose clusters, faces etched with the same hard lines the drought had carved into the fields. Clara felt their eyes on her, not with pity but with the cold calculation of survival. Widow now, they called her in murmurs, as if the words stripped her bare. Her hands trembled as she clutched the single-dollar coin in her pocket, her last, scraped from the bottom of a tin can buried under the floorboards. It was meant for seed, or medicine, or anything, to hold back the tide of nothing that threatened to drown her. She stopped at the edge of the crowd, the heat rising in waves from the ground, making her vision swim. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a mustache like twisted wire, banged his gavel on the block, his voice cutting through the haze like a dull blade. Livestock first, a sway-backed mule that fetched $3 from a rancher with pity in his eyes. Then tools, rusted and bent, going for pennies on the promise of repair. Clara's stomach twisted. Her own plow might end up there soon if the bank came calling. But she wasn't here to buy dreams. She was here because the whispers in the mercantile had spoken of cheap labormen down on their luck, sick or broken, sold off like stray dogs to whoever had a dollar and a need. The man they brought out next was barely a shadow of a cowboy. He slumped against the post they tied him to, his frame gaunt under a tattered shirt stained with fever sweat. His hat had fallen to the dust, revealing hair matted dark with grime, and his eyes, when they flickered, open held the dull glaze of a creature half gone to the other side. Coughs racked him, deep and wet, echoing Henry's last days so sharply that Clara's breath caught. The auctioneer prodded him with a stick, announcing him as Jack Harlan, drifter from the territories, sick with some lung rot, but strong enough for light chores if he lasted the week. Bidding started at $5, but the crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs rippling like wind through dry grass. No one wanted death on their doorstep. $4, $3. The numbers dropped like stones into a well, and Clara felt a pull in her chest, a foolish ache born of loneliness, and the ghost of Henry's voice telling her to be kind, even when the world wasn't. $2 now, and still silence. The man's head lolled, his breathing ragged, and for a moment she saw herself in him discarded, waiting for the end. $1. Her hand rose before she could think, the coin warm in her palm as she called out, her voice cracking like the earth beneath her. Sold, the gavel cracked, and the crowd dispersed like smoke, leaving her alone with the weight of what she'd done. She approached slow, knees weak from the heat and the folly, and untied the rope with fingers that shook. He didn't look up, just slumped forward, and she caught him before he hit the ground, his body light as a bundle of sticks, fever burning through his clothes. The dust settled around them, and the sun dipped a fraction, casting long shadows that stretched toward the horizon like fingers reaching for something lost. Clara half dragged, half carried him to her wagon, the old mare snorting uneasy at the scent of sickness. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of jolts and silence, the wheels creaking over ruts baked hard as iron. Her mind raced with regret. Would she feed another mouth when her own pantry held only cornmeal and withered potatoes? But beneath it, a spark of something defiant flickered, born from the emptiness Henry's death had left. The cabin loomed ahead, a squat shape against the flattening light, its windows dark as hollow eyes. Inside, him on the bed, the hearth cold and ashen, the room thick with the smell of stale air and faded lavender from sachets long forgotten. She fetched water from the bucket, cool against her skin, as she pressed a rag to his forehead. His eyes opened then, blue as a forgotten sky, and for the first time he spoke, voice a whisper, rough as sand. "Why?" But she turned away, stoking the fire with hands that remembered too well the chill of loss, the flames leaping up to chase the gathering dusk. As night fell, the wind moaned through the cracks in the plains, carrying the distant call of an owl. Clara sat by the rocker, watching his chest rise and fall uneven, and wondered if this stranger would bring ruin or reckoning. Memories crept in like thieves. Henry's proposal under a cottonwood tree, his hands calloused from plowing the stubborn soil, promising her a life if not easy, then shared. But fever had stolen him swift, leaving her to face the bank's demands alone, the land turning against her with its droughts and debts. Dawn crept in slow, painting the cabin walls with a thin gray light that did little to chase the chill. Clara stirred the pot over the fire, cornmeal mush bubbling thick and reluctant, the steam carrying a faint, acrid tang from the last of the salt pork. Her eyes burned from a night half-slept, broken by Jack's ragged breaths, and her own mind turning over the past like soil too dry to yield. She ladled a bowl for him, thin as it was, and set it by the bed where he lay, skin pale against the quilt her mother had pieced from scraps of better days. He woke with a start, eyes wild for a moment before settling on her face. No words passed, just a nod as he took the spoon with hands that trembled like aspen leaves in a breeze. Clara turned to the window, watching the plains stretch out endless, the grass bent low under the weight of morning dew that would vanish by noon. Henry's shadow lingered there, in the furrows he'd plowed last spring, now overgrown with weeds that mocked her efforts to keep the place alive. She'd found him one evening slumped by the fence, breath short and labored, the consumption eating him from the inside like fire through dry tinder. "We'll make it," he'd whispered, but the lie had hung between them, heavy as the mortgage papers from the bank in town. Jack ate slow, each swallow a small victory against the fever that still clung to him. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and leaned back, gaze drifting to the rafters where cobwebs danced in the draught. "Oh, you," he rasped, voice like gravel under boot. Clara shook her head, busying herself with mending a tear in his shirt, needle pricking her finger more than once. Blood welled up, a tiny bead she wiped on her apron, the sting a distraction from the knot in her chest. Kindness wasn't free out here. It cost in ways the land didn't forgive. By midday, the sun hung high, turning the air thick and shimmering. Clara hitched the mare to the plow, muscles aching as she guided it through the field, clods of earth turning over reluctant, baked hard from months without rain. Sweat stung her eyes, and she paused to wipe her brow, glancing back at the cabin where Jack had dragged himself to the porch. He sat there, hat pulled low, watching her with an intensity that unsettled her like he saw through to the hollow places inside. Memories flooded again, the day Henry brought her here, wagon loaded with hopes and a few crates of seed. Laughter had echoed then, but now the silence pressed in, broken only by the distant low of a steer from the neighbor's spread. That evening, as she boiled water for poultice, herbs, willow bark, and mustard seed, the last from her garden, Jack spoke more, words coming halting like a stream thawing in spring. He'd ridden trails from Texas to Montana, herding cattle for outfits that paid in dust and broken promises. Sickness caught him near the border, lungs filling with fire after a dust storm that blinded half his crew. "Thought I'd die out there," he said, staring into the flames. Buzzards circling, waiting patient. Clara listened, hands folding linen, feeling the pull of his story mirroring her own, the abandonment of fortune, the betrayal of body and land. Nights blurred into days, the rhythm of care settling like dust after a wind. She changed his bandages, the cloth coming away less bloody each time, and in return he mended the fence one afternoon, movements slow but sure, tools fitting his hands like old friends. Tension coiled in her gut, watching him work. Vulnerability crept in unbidden, the risk of hoping for more than survival. One twilight, as thunder grumbled on the horizon, promising rain that might not come, she found him by the well, drawing water with effort. "Why'd you buy me?" he asked again, bucket sloshing as he set it down. Clara met his eyes, the blue deeper now, less haunted. "Looked like you needed saving," she said, voice steady though her heart raced. "Same as me." Flashbacks came sharper then, in the quiet hours. Henry's final night, his hand in hers, whispering of a fortune he'd hidden, not gold, but a map to water rights he'd claimed years back, buried under the cottonwood. But grief had buried it deeper in her mind, forgotten amid the bank's threats to foreclose. Jack's presence stirred it loose, his tales of hidden canyons and lost claims echoing Henry's dream. She resisted at first, walls built high from loss, but his small gesture shopping wood without asking, sharing stories that made her laugh for the first time in months chipped away at the stone around her heart. One storm-swept morning, rain finally broke, pounding the roof like fists demanding entry. Clara woke to the scent of wet earth, a rare perfume that filled her with a tentative joy. Jack was up, fever broken fully now, stirring coffee over the fire. He handed her a mug, steam rising between them, and in that moment, the crossroads loomed. She could send him on, debt paid, or let him stay, risking the bloom of something new in this barren place. The rain eased to a drizzle, and outside, the plains glistened, cracks filling with promise. As days turned, Jack's strength returned, and with it, revelations. He spoke of a vein of silver he'd stumbled on years ago, up in the hills, marked on a scrap of paper tucked in his boot. Not for himself, he'd lost the taste for riches after seeing men kill for less, but for her, in repayment. Clara's hands shook as she unfolded it, the lines blurring with tears, worth more than any fortune in the quiet redemption it offered. Yet it was his staying, the shared silences and mended fences, that transformed the emptiness. The rain lingered for a spell, soaking the plains until the air hung thick with the smell of wet sage and renewed earth, a scent that Clara breathed in like a long-denied comfort. She stood on the porch one afternoon, watching Jack mend the corral fence, his movements steady now, the cough reduced to a rare rattle in his chest. The hammer fell in rhythmic thuds, each strike echoing across the flatland, chasing away the ghosts that had haunted her solitary days. Her hands rested on the rail, rough wood splintering under her fingers, a small pain that grounded her amid the shifting inside. Jack paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve that bore her stitches, and glanced her way. His eyes held a question unspoken, the blue softened by the overcast sky. Clara turned back to the fields, where green shoots pushed through the muddied soil, defiant against the drought's memory. The bank's letter lay heavy in her apron pocket, a demand for payment or forfeiture, words as cold as the grave dirt she'd thrown on Henry's coffin. But with Jack's map unfolded on the kitchen table, that morning line scratched in faded ink, pointing to a canyon crease in the hills, she felt a stir of possibility, fragile as new leaves. Evenings brought them closer to the fire, the crackle of logs filling the spaces where words faltered. Jack spoke of his wanderings, a boyhood on a Kansas farm lost to locusts. Trails blazed through blizzards that claimed comrades, the silver vein discovered by accident during a cattle drive gone awry. "Hid it away," he said, voice low as the wind outside, thinking someday it'd matter. Never did, till now. Clara listened, her needle pausing in the quilt she patched, threads pulling together fragments like her scattered thoughts. Memories surfaced, unbidden Henry's fevered dreams of striking rich, his hands sketching maps in the air, promising her security beyond the plow's grind. She'd dismissed them as delirium, but now they aligned with Jack's tale, two paths converging in this unlikely refuge. One dusk, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Clara led him to the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, its branches whispering in the breeze like old confidants. She knelt in the damp grass, fingers digging into the soft earth where Henry had buried his secrets. The tin box emerged crusted with soil, inside a deed to water rights long forgotten, papers yellowed but intact. Jack stood silent beside her, his presence a steady warmth against the cooling air. "Worth more than silver," she murmured, voice catching on the lump in her throat. He nodded, hand brushing hers accidental, sending a jolt through her like lightning far off. Tension built in the quiet days that followed, the crossroads looming clear as a fork in the trail. Clara woke one night to thunder rumbling distant, sheets tangled from dreams of abandonment, Henry's wagon fading, the auctioneer's gavel falling, Jack riding away without a backward glance. She slipped from bed, floorboards creaking underfoot, and found him on the porch, staring at stars pricking the velvet sky. "You could go," she said, words escaping before she could rein them in. "Debts paid." He turned, face shadowed, and the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. "Could," he replied, voice gravel, soft. "But staying feels like coming home." The choice settled over her gradual, like dawn light filtering through curtains. She risked hope in small ways, sharing the last jar of preserved peaches, their sweetness cutting the bitterness of lean meals, riding out together to scout the canyon, horses' hooves clattering on stone, the air sharp with pine and promise. Jack's hand steadied her as they descended the slope, the vein glinting faint in the rock face, a fortune not in ore alone but in the rebirth it symbolized. Yet vulnerability gnawed at her, the fear of loss reborn, Henry's absence, a wound that Jack's presence salved but couldn't erase. Flashbacks wove through her days. The wedding under that same cottonwood, Henry's laugh warm as summer rain, the bank's men riding up last fall, eyes hard as flint, demanding what the land wouldn't give. Now, with Jack's strength bolstering hers, they worked the claim subtle, panning flecks that amounted to enough for the mortgage payment, delivered to town in a pouch heavy with redemption. The banker's surprise mirrored her own, the deed stamped paid, the homestead secure. As autumn whispered in, leaves turning gold on the distant hills, Clara felt the transformation deep in her bones. Jack's gesture carving a new handle for her spade, humming tunes from his trail, days wove into the fabric of her life, mending the tears grief had left. The fortune he gave wasn't just the silver or the water rights, but the quiet power of companionship, pulling her from isolation's grip. One evening, as smoke rose lazy from the chimney, curling into the twilight sky, she sat beside him on the porch, hands entwined without thought. The wind carried the scent of coming frost, but warmth bloomed within, a resilient flame against the gathering dark. Winter settled over the plains like a heavy blanket, the first snow dusting the ground in fragile white, muting the world's edges. Clara rose before dawn, breath fogging the air as she kindled the fire, embers glowing faint against the cold that seeped through the cabin walls. The pot clanged softly as she set it to boil, oats swirling in the water, a simple meal thickened with the last of the dried apples from the root cellar. Her hands, chapped and raw from scrubbing, paused over the steam, warmth seeping into skin that remembered too many harsh seasons alone. Jack stirred in the bed they'd come to share, not out of passion at first, but necessity the single room's heat conserved against the biting nights. His arm reached out, finding her waist in the dim light, a gesture grown natural as breathing. She leaned into it briefly, the solidity of him a counter to the emptiness that had once filled her days. Outside, the wind howled low, rattling the shutters like restless spirits, and she thought of Henry, buried under that same snow, his grave a mound softened by time. The past weighed less now, not gone but folded into the present, like old letters tucked away. Mornings blurred into chores, Jack chopping wood with an axe that bit deep into frozen logs, splinters flying like sparks. Clara tending the hen coop, gathering eggs that cracked cold in her palms. They worked in tandem, words sparse but loaded with meaning. A glance across the yard, a shared nod when the mare nickered uneasy at coyote tracks. The silver from the vein had been assayed in town, coins heavy in her pocket as she paid the mercantile tab. The clerk's eyes widening at the widow who'd turned fortune from folly. But the true worth lay elsewhere, in the quiet rebuilding of a life fractured by loss. One midday, as flakes fell lazy from a leaden sky, Clara rode into the hills alone, horse plodding through drifts that muffled sound. The canyon loomed, its walls etched with frost, the vein a dark scar against the white. She dismounted, boots sinking deep, and traced the rock with gloved fingers, feeling the pulse of what lay beneath. Memories surged. Henry's tales of hidden wealth, dismissed as fever dreams. The auction block where Jack had stood, life ebbing like sand through an hourglass. Buying him had been an act of desperation, but what he'd given strength, stories, a map to more than metal had redeemed them both. Hope, once resisted, now rooted deep, resilient as the scrub oak clinging to the slopes. Back at the cabin, smoke curled from the chimney, a beacon in the gathering dusk. Jack met her at the door, concern etching his brow as he brushed snow from her shoulders. "Thought you'd got lost," he said, voice rough with unspoken fear. Clara shook her head, hanging her coat by the fire, the melt dripping steady like tears long held. That night, as they sat by the hearth, flames dancing shadows on the walls, she spoke of the crossroads past the choice, to let vulnerability in, to risk heart for the chance of wholeness. "Could have sent you on," she whispered, hand on his knee. He covered it with his own, calluses matching hers. "Glad you didn't." Days lengthened toward spring, snow melting into rivulets that fed the parched earth, swelling the creek with Henry's water rights now claimed and flowing. Jack built a new shed, hammers ringing clear in the crisp air, while Clara planted seeds in furrows turned fresh, earth yielding under her spade. Tension eased, replaced by a rhythm of shared purpose, mending harnesses together, laughter bubbling up over a botched pie crust, bodies finding solace in the dark. The transformation bloomed subtle, emotional layers peeling back like onion, skin's abandonment giving way to presence, grief to quiet joy. One twilight, as the sun dipped low, painting the plains in hues of amber and rose, Clara walked the fields with Jack, hands linked loose. Buzzards wheeled overhead, distant now, no longer omens but part of the vast indifference that had once threatened to swallow her. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying scents of thawing soil and budding life. In that moment, acceptance settled, a rebirth not loud but profound. The fortune of connection worth more than any claim staked. Yet the past echoed faint in the crack of earth underfoot, reminding her of the dust that had risen that fateful day in town. Smoke rose from their chimney, twisting upward like a prayer answered, and Clara felt a peace that warmed deeper than any fire. Spring unfurled across the plains in tentative bursts, the grass greening underfoot like a promise kept after long denial. Clara knelt in the garden one morning, fingers sinking into the loamy soil as she pressed seeds into rows, the earth cool and yielding where once it had cracked defiant. The air carried the sharp tang of new growth, mingled with the distant low of cattle from neighboring spreads, a sound that no longer mocked her isolation, but wove into the tapestry of days shared. Her back ached from the work, a familiar twinge that grounded her, reminding her of seasons turned alone, now softened by Jack's shadow falling beside her. He joined her without words, spade in hand, turning over clods with a rhythm born of trails long ridden. His shirt sleeves rolled up, revealed arms corded from labor. The fever's pallor faded to a healthy tan kissed by the sun. Clara glanced at him, noting the way his hair curled damp at the nape, the quiet focus in his eyes that mirrored her own. Small gestures had become their language, a bucket of water drawn fresh for her wash, a wildflower tucked behind her ear at dusk, each one chipping away at the walls of abandonment she'd built high. The fortune he'd unearthed silver, sold discreetly in town, enough to stock the barn and mend the roof paled beside this. The emotional alchemy of trust, reborn from ashes. Afternoons stretched lazy under a sky vast and blue, the heat building slow as they rode the fence line, checking posts that Jack had reinforced against winter's bite. The mare stepped sure, her coat gleaming from oats afforded by their windfall, and Clara felt the wind tug at her bonnet, carrying scents of wild mustard blooming yellow along the creek. Memories intruded gentle now, not as wounds but as echoes. Henry's hand guiding hers on the reins, their first ride together, his voice low, with plans for a family that never came. Grief had transformed, no longer a weight dragging her down but a quiet companion, making room for the warmth Jack kindled with his steady presence. One evening, as thunderheads gathered dark on the horizon, promising a storm to quench the thirsty land, Clara found an old letter in the trunk under the bed. Henry's words scrawled in fading ink, speaking of love and resilience amid hardship. She read it by lantern light, tears blurring the lines, and Jack sat across, whittling a spoon from cottonwood branch, his knife strokes deliberate. "He gave you strength," he said soft, not looking up. Clara folded the paper, chest tight with the crossroads, fully crossed the choice to embrace this new chapter. Vulnerability laid bare like the plains after rain. "And you gave me back to myself," she replied, voice steady, the words a bridge over the chasm of loss. Nights deepened their bond, bodies entwining under quilts pieced from remnants of past lives, the cabin filled with murmurs and sighs that chased the silence. Jack's stories flowed freer, a childhood marked by a father's abandonment, trails where betrayal came swift as a rattler's strike, the sickness that had stripped him bare until her dollar pulled him from the brink. In turn, Clara shared her own girlhood dreams, shattered by drought, marriage to Henry, a beacon in the dust, widowhood, a storm that nearly broke her. Redemption unfolded not in grand gestures but in these confessions, emotions raw and authentic, transforming isolation into intimacy. As summer hinted with warmer winds, the homestead flourished, crops standing tall in fields once barren, the well brimming from rights claimed true. Jack built a swing on the porch from salvaged timber, and they sat there at twilight, rocking gentle as the world hushed. Buzzards still circled high, but distant, their shadows no longer omens of despair. The fortune what he gave her was this quiet power, a life rebuilt from fragments, resilience blooming where abandonment had sown doubt. One dawn, rain fell soft, washing the air clean, and Clara stepped out, boots sinking into the damp ground that mirrored her softened heart. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals, twisting upward like the dust that had swirled around her that day in town, no longer a curse but a cycle closed in grace.